Ronald Reagan will help sweep in an era of conservatism. He will serve as president for 8 years, and as vice president, George Bush will serve 4 more years. The 1980s will usher in a period of prosperity and controversy, all in the shadow of the last decade of the Cold War. Reagan's aggressive foreign policy will result in the eventual end of the Cold War. Politics in the U.S. can be described as a spectrum. Most Americans lie in the middle, but the spectrum can shift depending on the mood of the country at a particular time. If the country shifts left, we say the country is in a liberal mood, hence the words liberal and left meaning the same thing. If the country shifts right, we say the country is in a conservative mood, therefore conservative and right mean the same thing. Democrats are considered liberal. Republicans are conservative. If you're talking presidents, Nixon belongs on the right, as he is more conservative. Ford, his replacement, was also a conservative, so he also goes on the right. Carter is next. He goes on the left because he's a Democrat. Democrats are pro-choice, or they support the right of a woman to choose what to do with her body, which is a liberal point of view. Conservatives are pro-life and oppose abortion at any stage. Affirmative action was a policy to help minorities overcome past oppression. This was introduced by LBJ and the Democrats, which puts it on the left. Republicans are the party of pro-business and therefore support deregulation of industries, which goes on the right. During Reagan's presidency, several conservative and religious groups contributed to his policies. He was heavily influenced by the Heritage Foundation, a conservative group that created policies to reduce the size of government. Reagan followed the policies of the Heritage Foundation and severely cut numerous federal programs. Another group that influenced Reagan and many Americans was the Moral Majority. This group, led by Jerry Falwell, convinced conservative Christians to vote for Republicans in the 1980s by attacking the policies created by Democrats throughout the 60s and 70s. To understand the 1980s and the rise of conservatism, we must understand what conservatives stood for. Remember, a platform is a document stating the goals and principles of a political party. Conservatives opposed big government, New Deal liberalism, gun control, feminism, gay rights, welfare, affirmative action, sexual permissiveness, and drug use. Conservatives supported family and religious values, a strong work ethic, national security, lower taxes, improved morals, and an end to quotas and preferential treatment based on race and ethnic background. The presidential election of 1980 featured a contest between incumbent Democrat Jimmy Carter and his Republican opponent Ronald Reagan, as well as a Republican Congressman John B. Anderson, who ran as an independent. Reagan, aided by the Iran hostage crisis and a worsening economy at home, won the election in a landslide. Carter, after defeating Ted Kennedy for the Democratic nomination, attacked Reagan as a dangerous right-wing radical. For his part, Reagan, the former governor of California, repeatedly ridiculed Carter and won a decisive victory. In the simultaneous congressional elections, Republicans won control of the U.S. Senate for the first time in 28 years. This election marked the beginning of what is popularly known as the Reagan Revolution. Reagan's election broke up the New Deal coalition by taking 50% of blue-collar votes. It also ended 50 years of Democratic control by Congress by taking control of the Senate and making huge gains in the House of Representatives. The moral majority targeted and defeated vulnerable liberal Democrats. Political analysts marked the 1980 election as the end of the half-century of Democratic dominance of Congress. Reagan had a plan to overcome stagflation, or high unemployment plus high inflation. His economic plan was known as Reaganomics, or supply-side economics. Under his plan, the government cut taxes on the rich, hoping that they would invest that money and create more jobs. Additionally, Reagan cut federal spending, which included over $40 billion from programs like food stamps, student loans, and mass transportation. The biggest problem facing the economy in the 1970s was stagflation. In order to battle this, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates. As a result, exports and spending dropped, leading to further job cuts and a much higher unemployment rate in the first 2 years of Reagan's term. Reagan and the Republicans supported the policy of deregulation. Deregulation is the cutting back of government regulation of industries. Reagan started by removing price controls on oil and gas, which led to increased production and lower gas prices. The deregulation of savings and loan industries would lead to future fraud and scandals that will impact the economy. Under deregulation, the airline industry was also able to become more competitive. The creation of hub cities allowed for more airlines and more flights, an unprecedented growth in the airline industry. Most importantly, Reagan reduced regulation of the environment. He actually put people in charge of the EPA who were against its very existence. They sold off public lands to private developers, drilled for oil in protected places, and cut timber in national forests. Reagan also deregulated the auto industry, easing up on pollution restrictions, allowing it to recover more quickly. Companies like Chrysler, which nearly went bankrupt in the 1970s, returned to success. The government also reduced restrictions on the free market economy. Businesses got bigger. Corporate raiders raised money with junk bonds, which were high-interest, high-risk securities, and snapped up profitable and cash-rich companies that could be milked of profits and assets. The merger mania channeled capital into paper transactions rather than investments in new equipment and products. There were more and more corporate mergers and takeovers throughout the 1980s. Labor unions would also suffer. Reagan, opposing a strike by the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Union, or Patco, in the summer of 1981. Reagan denounced Patco for threatening to interrupt the protective services which are government's reason for being. He fired more than 11,000 striking workers, decertified the union, and ordered the hiring and training of thousands of new air traffic controllers, which cost over $1.3 billion. For the Reagan administration, the price was worth paying to prove that no groups of government employees had the right to defy the public interest. Government support of this anti-union drive hastened the decline of labor unions during the 1980s. With Reagan's example of Patco, large companies such as Hormel and Phelps Dodge chose that option, undercutting the strike as an effective union strategy. In 1982, we had another recession, the worst since the Great Depression. Banks failed, and there was almost 11% unemployment. It lasted from July 1981 to November 1982. Especially hard hit were the old industries like steel and textiles. These industries, hurt by foreign competition, laid off thousands of workers. And due to budget cuts, fewer than half of those who lost their jobs received unemployment payments. By the middle of 1982, almost 1/5 of blue-collar workers were jobless. Each week, 450 businesses went bankrupt, the highest rate since the 1930s. The recession was caused in part by high interest rates. The Fed, the Federal Reserve, had raised interest rates in 1981 to try to stop inflation. This policy, combined with the drop in the price of oil and other imports, eventually brought inflation down. Then the Fed began lowering interest rates, and investments increased. In 1983, the economy began to recover. This was led by a fall in oil prices, which reduced the double-digit inflation rate to less than 4%. Reagan also sought to control the growth of New Deal Great Society welfare state. This helped sustain a long period of recovery from 1983 to 1992. Supply-side economics widened the gap between rich and the poor. More money was in the hands of investors and high-income Americans. But for those at the bottom of the economic ladder, the decade was one of growing frustration and hardship. By the mid-1980s, roughly 35 million Americans lived below the official poverty line, which was $10,000 per year for a family of 4. The percentage of poor people had increased from roughly 11.5% in the 1970s to 15% in the 1980s. The standard of living for the middle class remained the same. Economic policies benefited mainly yuppies and upper-income groups. We also had a rising federal deficit, over $200 billion per year. This happened because Reagan cut taxes so much while he also increased military spending drastically. This led to the debate about what government programs should be cut to help reduce the deficit. Over 8 years, the national debt would triple from $900 billion to $2.7 trillion. These tax cuts stimulated consumption more than investment, especially in foreign-made luxury and consumer items. The use of credit increased in the lower and middle classes, which became saddled with more and more debt. All these contributed to an increased trade deficit, which reached $150 billion per year. Over 8 years, it was $1 trillion, which led to more foreign ownership in U.S. real estate and industry. The net effect was that by 1985, the U.S. had become a debtor nation for the first time since World War I. Deregulation led to questionable banking practices like the savings and loan crisis. Savings and loans had traditionally been conservative financial institutions, or banks, that funneled individual savings into safe home mortgages. Under new rules, they began to compete for deposits by offering high interest rates and in reinvesting the money in much riskier commercial real estate. By 1990, the result was a financial crisis in which bad loans destroyed hundreds of savings and loans, especially in the Southwest. American taxpayers were left to bail out depositors to the tune of $500 billion to prevent a collapse of the nation's financial and credit system. With the deregulation of financial markets, corporate consolidations and mergers flourished. Critics of Reaganomics suggested that his policies also contributed to the stock market crash on October 19, 1987, also known as Black Monday. The stock market crashed 22%, starting a worldwide crash that would take several years for the world markets to recover from. Since the 1920s, Americans have waged a culture war against itself, beginning with the traditional versus modern value struggle showcased in the Scopes monkey trial. The culture war refers to the idea that there are two cultural classes in the U.S., and that these two groups engage in a constant battle over values. Many times it has been simplified into a clash between liberals and conservatives. It came to prominence in the 1980s with the shift of many Americans to a more conservative mindset. An increasing number of hot-button issues such as race, abortion, gun control, gay rights, education, religion, drugs, and feminism drove Americans to the two opposing sides of those issues. Society divided itself, creating two warring groups defined by their ideological views. For example, conservatives fought back against the rise of feminism of the 1970s, with evangelical Christians leading the charge. Their claim was that the changing gender roles and sexuality was a threat to American way of life. This conflict became possible because of the end of the Cold War, a unifying event that Americans generally agreed on. Probably the single most influential thing that a president can do is nominate a judge to the Supreme Court. It's important because a Supreme Court justice serves for life, or until they choose to retire. Reagan appointed conservatives Antonin Scalia, Anthony Kennedy, Sandra Day O'Connor, and William Rehnquist as Chief Justice. His goal was to create a more conservative Supreme Court to correct or reform social issues like abortion. Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court justice, was a moderate conservative who refused to overturn Roe v. Wade and was the deciding vote in the Bush v. Gore case in 2000. She retired in 2006 and was replaced by Samuel Alito.